Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, the Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you get any sort of value entertainment out of these videos, all I ask is that you hit thumbs up, subscribe. I appreciate your support. Whether you're bullish or bearish in the Canadian real estate market, the purpose of these videos is always to educate and build the community here with you. So if you have any questions or comments, just put those below. I just ask that people are respectful in the comment section, regardless of your views. I mean, everybody has a different viewpoint of this market. Certainly I have mine, but and again, it goes to everyone's circumstances and life and worldviews and beliefs are completely different. I mean, there's a reason why real estate developers or people in that industry are always going to be bullish because they're financially invested in it. It's actually, in the investing world, it's called complacency bias, or sort of a confirmation bias, which basically you seek out information and facts that confirm your world view. But regardless of that, I really want to talk on the whole Canadian real estate picture today and tie sort of everything in together. Quick couple things before we get in. I've recently come across I now have access to all of the Canadian real estate data for all the real estate boards across Canada. I'm going to start aggregating some of that data. I'm going to probably start talking a little bit about other markets if that's something that you guys would be interested in, and if it's something I feel is worthwhile touching on, because I do like that whole sector, that whole view of the Canadian markets. So yeah, that's what we're up to. Also looking at potentially building up a fund here if somebody has any interest in that. I've had quite a few of my investors and clients said they'd be interested in putting a pool together, really seeking out various real estate projects if we feel that there's an opportunity there to do that. So you can I'll put my email in the comments description below, so if that's something that might interest you, feel free to email me and I'll get back to you on that. But it's going to be for select few. You're going to have to be obviously vetted. We're not just going to take anybody's money, so it has to be the right, and it's very, very early, so I'm not going to get too much into the details, but again, if that's something that potentially interests you, just send me an email. Again, looking at the whole picture, Canadian real estate sales, CREA, which is the Canadian Real Estate Association, who I'm going to be referencing from here on out. So it's called CREA. They released their latest report, and that was national home sales dropped 17% on a year-over-year basis. I believe they slid below the 10-year average for the month. The president basically came out and cited, yes, the mortgage stress test is starting to have its bite. It's pulled some of that demand forward. We're expecting much weaker sales in 2018. Interesting enough, they also revised their price forecasts, and so they're actually now forecasting a national decline in the average sales price by 2.3% this year. So they believe prices will drop 2.3%. In BC, they had a 0.5% reduction in prices this year. Now, I take that with a grain of salt. I look at it as CREA, who is obviously involved in the industry, I'm not sure if it's a mandate, but obviously it's in their best interest to keep market sentiment relatively upbeat. They're never ever going to come out and say, hey, we expect prices to drop 10% or 20%, sales are going to get cut in half, etc. They're always an optimistic bunch, so I don't take their forecasts much. I'm usually just looking at their wording, what's their sentiment, right? So if they're forecasting a 2.3% decline, I generally tend to think it's going to be worse than that. But again, I could be very well wrong, and it could increase this year for all we know. Nobody knows, and that's why I never forecast things here. It's merely just taking the facts and the data that we have now and applying it to your own circumstances and letting you interpret how you see fit. Again, that could tie into your specific worldview and your exact position of where you are in life, right? So but yeah, I mean, again, I just look at that from CREA's perspective and say, okay, sales are down 17%. Now they're forecasting lower prices. That's how I'm looking at it. I think this all ties in though, right? In a global macro perspective. I mean, obviously there's the thesis out there. I almost want to say it's a myth, but it is true to some extent that real estate markets are very local. Each market is doing something slightly different than the other. But there are parts of these markets that are all interconnected, particularly in the Canadian lending space, the ability and access to credit, banks' enthusiasm to lend into the markets. That's all tied together. I mean, obviously, as national home sales are starting to decline, that has some serious impacts across the board. Not only last week in the Bank of Canada's decision to hold firm on rates, many people are saying they might only get away with one rate hike this year now. But in outside investors' enthusiasm about investing into the Canadian economy, per Stats Canada and BlackRock, which is a hedge fund in the United States, foreign direct investment into Canada dropped 27% in 2017. So that's really just investors looking at the Canadian economy in general and going, no, not really that interested. They're not as optimistic about it. So yeah, I mean, that all plays a role, right? I mean, we are siphoning off a lot of our mortgage-backed securities to outside foreign investment. So, does that mean the yield on that security has to go up? How satisfied will investors be moving forward about purchasing up, mortgage-backed securities if our real estate starts to decline? And they're going to obviously demand a higher yield on that, and that in turn relates into higher borrowing costs for us locally. So these markets really all tie in together to some extent. Now obviously there's a lot of moving pieces, so that's primarily why we can't predict, because we never know what's going to happen. We just take the data as it comes in and we make decisions with it. But I think that the landscape is still there in general. These loose financial conditions, which I believe are starting to tighten up, obviously, as we're seeing central banks start to raise interest rates. But, you just look at the United States, their circumstances where they are right now. Home flipping is actually a 10-year, or I believe 11-year high. The amount of homes being flipped hasn't been as high since, I think, 2007. So, I mean, that's interesting, right? I mean, people think that Vancouver or Toronto or Canada is this unique situation, but again, we're seeing rising real estate prices on a global level, and that's really, when you keep interest rates suppressed at these ultra low levels, it just forces capital to seek out a return, and that's why we're seeing home flipping. And it's interesting to see the correlation in the United States, again looking at those charts, is that home flipping is on 11-year high, and coincidentally their inventory is at I believe a decade low. So and this is part of the thing that I've been trying to emphasize in Vancouver. It's not necessarily that we have no supply. We don't have any supply, but it's not necessarily that we're not building enough or there's not enough per se. It's that when you have flipping, where you say, okay, condo flipping in Vancouver is at a 9-year high. So is it so much that we have a supreme shortage of condos, or is it you have a lot of sort of fake demand out there that really is only there speculating on the market because prices are rising and there's still a lot of liquidity in the market? But as prices dry up or stop rising, as we're seeing in the Vancouver detached market, house flipping then drops off. I believe house flipping is at a 5 or 6 year low in the detached market. Something along those lines. I've done a blog on it before, but that's sort of how these things shape up, right? So, but we're starting to see these financial conditions starting to tighten. I am curious to see how these things shape up. But again, from that global perspective, really looking at national home sales, I do think it all ties in to some extent. So I'll be watching those, and obviously now with the access to real estate data across Canada, I'm very, very excited about that. I'm going to do some more work on that, and would love your feedback on that if that's something you're interested in following, other markets, about potential opportunities, etc. This is really where my passion lies. But obviously my bread and butter is still Vancouver, but I do like looking at other markets as well. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. It's all I had to talk on. Again, if you have any questions or comments, put those below. We'll banter back and forth, and I'll see you next week.